Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Paula Brack. I'm the Executive Director at the Sarah House, and I will be joined with Deb Green, who is our SANE Coordinator, as we talk about responding to sexual assault, domestic violence, and strangulation in rural communities. The agenda will be what is the Sarah House, responding to sexual assault, responding to domestic violence, strangulation and strangulation assessment, and what does ACRD and SADE mean, and how can a rural program manage to meet the responsibilities under those requirements? So who are we, and what is the Sarah House? The Sarah House is a nonprofit organization that wears multiple hats. We are a child advocacy center, helping to investigate child abuse and child sexual assault. We provide sex assault and DV response advocacy and emergency assistance, and we provide opportunities for prevention education and outreach activities throughout the district. The area marked in blue is the geographical area in which we serve. It is a 13 judicial district, 7 counties in the northeast region of Colorado. We are the only provider in the geographical area for medical forensic examinations and for forensic interviewing for victims and survivors of all ages. SADE, which is Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative, is the integration of active listening and trauma-informed approaches into sexual assault, services including continual attention to mitigating vicarious trauma. All of our individual and social identities and experiences are overlapping and intersecting. Race, ethnicity, class, ability, sexual orientation, and gender identity all have an impact on the risk of experiencing sexual violence. For survivors, this also influences access to the options available for healing and support after violence. The intersectionality of domestic violence and sexual assault is prevalent. When providing domestic violence services, ACRD can be a great tool, while SADE provides extensive equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, tips for sexual violence, especially in dual programs specifically. The framework incorporates an understanding of trauma and its effects. Creating an inclusive and accessible environment for healing is of great importance. Understanding the range of people's experiences and keeping an open mind and a willingness to understand and talk and listen to a survivor so that you have an understanding of what their needs are, and understanding the range of their experiences, recognizing the centrality of culture that is relevant to the people and communities we serve. There must be a commitment to social justice and human rights. Guiding principles of SADE apply anti-oppression and empowerment-based work. There must be a clear organizational identity as a provider of SA services, especially when you are a dual program. You must have explicit and agency-wide support and stable and empowering leadership in order to support and care for the staff and prioritize sexual violence-specific training that meets the needs of SA survivors, with an emphasis on embracing change and growth within an organization. Oppression has a direct impact on survivors, both in how they experience trauma, as well as what resources are available to them as they heal. 3 key things for advocates to keep in mind are that anti-oppression work first starts with ourselves. We all have biases we need to work through. It's easier to notice things out there that are problematic, but we first must start with ourselves. An advocate's work is to provide safe and supportive services for all survivors in a manner that allows for one to show up as their whole selves, with all of their identities and their experiences. Advocates must practice awareness that because oppression exists in our society, options and experiences are not the same for each person. Advocacy should center the person's self-identified needs and trust that the survivor as the best expert on their own experiences. Organizational outcomes could include increased effectiveness of services and work with system and other non-system programs and the community at large. Increased confidence in providing services, advocating in systems, and identifying sexual violence. Shared responsibility for providing sexual assault services. Clearer organizational identity as a provider of sexual assault services. And new and revised policies and procedures that are reviewed annually by the board and the staff involved. Trauma affects individuals across their lifespan, in their daily activities, their social interactions, their ability to cope, the way they see themselves, and their confidence and trust in others. Trauma can affect survivors' access and response to services, including their willingness to reach out and engage, mobilization of resources and decision-making, response to advocacy and support, the response to law enforcement and the criminal justice system, their ability and their willingness and their readiness to appear and testify in court. Programmatic goals may include integration of active listening and trauma-informed approaches into sexual assault services, including continual attention to mitigating vicarious trauma, group-based services to support healing from trauma, increased community outreach focused on sexual violence, and the development of multilingual and cultural specific services that may cross state lines, county lines, and even countries. While listening and watching the video on the next slide, think about what you hear. What are the red flags that the survivor may have ignored, and what her family may have ignored? What are her priorities in this relationship?
I'm here today to talk about a disturbing question, which has an equally disturbing answer. My topic is the secrets of domestic violence. And the question I'm going to tackle is the one question everyone always asks. Why does she stay? Why would anyone stay with a man who beats her? I'm not a psychiatrist, a social worker, or an expert in domestic violence. I'm just one woman with a story to tell. I was 22. I had just graduated from Harvard College. I'd moved to New York City for my first job as a writer and editor at 17 magazine. I had my first apartment, my first little green American Express card, and I had a very big secret. My secret was that I had this gun loaded with hollow point bullets pointed at my head by the man who I thought was my soulmate many, many times. The man who I loved more than anybody on earth held a gun to my head and threatened to kill me more times than I can even remember. I'm here to tell you the story of crazy love, a psychological trap disguised as love, one that millions of women and even a few men fall into every year. It may even be your story. I don't look like a typical domestic violence survivor. I have a BA in English from Harvard College, an MBA in marketing from Wharton Business School. I spent most of my career working for Fortune 500 companies, including Johnson & Johnson, Leo Burnett, and the Washington Post. I've been married for almost 20 years to my second husband, and we have 3 kids together. My dog is a black lab, and I drive a Honda Odyssey minivan. So my first message for you is that domestic violence happens to everyone. All races, all religions, all income and education levels. It's everywhere. And my second message is that everyone thinks domestic violence happens to women, that it's a women's issue. Not exactly. Over 85% of abusers are men. And domestic abuse happens only in intimate, interdependent, long-term relationships. In other words, in families. The last place we would want or expect to find violence, which is one reason domestic abuse is so confusing. I would have told you myself that I was the last person on earth who would stay with a man who beats me. But in fact, I was a very typical victim because of my age. I was 22. And in the United States, women ages 16 to 24 are 3 times as likely to be domestic violence victims as women of other ages. And over 500 women and girls this age are killed every year by abusive partners, boyfriends and husbands in the United States. I was also a very typical victim because I knew nothing about domestic violence, its warning signs or its patterns. I met Connor on a cold, rainy January night. He sat next to me on the New York City subway, and he started chatting me up. He told me 2 things. One was that he, too, had just graduated from an Ivy League school, and that he worked at a very impressive Wall Street bank. But what made the biggest impression on me that first meeting was that he was smart and funny, and he looked like a farm boy. He had these big cheeks, these big apple cheeks, and this wheat blonde hair, and he seemed so sweet. One of the smartest things Connor did from the very beginning was to create the illusion that I was the dominant partner in the relationship. He did this, especially at the beginning, by idolizing me. We started dating, and he loved everything about me. That I was smart, that I'd gone to Harvard, that I was passionate about helping teenage girls and my job. He wanted to know everything about my family and my childhood, my hopes and dreams. Connor believed in me as a writer and a woman in a way that no one else ever had. And he also created a magical atmosphere of trust between us by confessing his secret, which was that as a very young boy, starting at age 4, he had been savagely and repeatedly physically abused by his stepfather. And the abuse had gotten so bad that he had had to drop out of school in 8th grade, even though he was very smart. And he'd spent almost 20 years rebuilding his life, which is why that Ivy League degree and the Wall Street job and his bright, shiny future meant so much to him. If you had told me that this smart, funny, sensitive man who adored me would one day dictate whether or not I wore makeup, how short my skirts were, where I lived, what jobs I took, who my friends were, and where I spent Christmas, I would have laughed at you. Because there was not a hint of violence or control or anger in Connor at the beginning. I didn't know that the first stage in any domestic violence relationship is to seduce and charm the victim. I also didn't know that the second step is to isolate the victim. Now, Connor did not come home one day and announce, hey, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff has been great, but I need to move into the next phase where I isolate you and I abuse you. So I need to get you out of this apartment where the neighbors can hear you scream and out of this city where you have friends and family and coworkers who can see the bruises. Instead, Connor came home one Friday evening and he told me that he had quit his job that day, his dream job. And he said that he had quit his job because of me, because I had made him feel so safe and loved that he didn't need to prove himself on Wall Street anymore. And he just wanted to get out of the city and away from his abusive, dysfunctional family and move to a tiny town in New England where he could start his life over with me by his side. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was leave New York and my dream job. But I thought you made sacrifices for your soulmate. So I agreed, and I quit my job, and Connor and I left Manhattan together. I had no idea I was falling into crazy love, that I was walking headfirst into a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap. The next step in the domestic violence pattern is to introduce the threat of violence and see how she reacts. And here's where those guns come in. As soon as we moved to New England, that place where Connor was supposed to feel so safe, he bought 3 guns. He kept one in the glove compartment of our car. He kept one under the pillows on our bed. And the third one he kept in his pocket at all times. And he said that he needed those guns because of the trauma he'd experienced as a young boy He needed them to feel protected. But those guns were really a message for me. And even though he hadn't raised a hand to me, my life was already in grave danger every minute of every day. Connor first physically attacked me 5 days before our wedding. It was 7 a.m. I still had on my nightgown. I was working on my computer trying to finish a freelance writing assignment, and I got frustrated. And Connor used my anger as an excuse to put both of his hands around my neck and to squeeze so tightly that I could not breathe or scream. And he used the chokehold to hit my head repeatedly against the wall. 5 days later, the 10 bruises on my neck had just faded, and I put on my mother's wedding dress, and I married him. Despite what had happened, I was sure we were going to live happily ever after, because I loved him, and he loved me so much. And he was very, very sorry. He had just been really stressed out by the wedding and by becoming a family with me. It was an isolated incident, and he was never going to hurt me again. It happened twice more on the honeymoon. The first time, I was driving to find a secret beach, and I got lost. And he punched me in the side of my head so hard that the other side of my head repeatedly hit the driver's side window. And then a few days later, driving home from our honeymoon, he got frustrated by traffic, and he threw a cold Big Mac in my face. Connor proceeded to beat me once or twice a week for the next 2.5 years of our marriage. I was mistaken in thinking that I was unique and alone in this situation. 1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life. And the CDC reports that 15 million children are abused every year. 15 million. So actually, I was in very good company. Back to my question. Why did I stay? The answer is easy. I didn't know he was abusing me. Even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me downstairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? Why didn't I walk out? I could have left any time. To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask, because we victims know something you usually don't. It's incredibly dangerous to leave an abuser, because the final step in the domestic violence pattern is kill her. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose. Other outcomes include long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries, denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family court system to terrify the victim and her children, who are regularly forced by family court judges to spend unsupervised time with the man who beat their mother. And still we ask, why doesn't she just leave? I was able to leave because of one final sadistic beating that broke through my denial. I realized that the man who I loved so much was going to kill me if I let him. So I broke the silence. I told everyone. The police, my neighbors, my friends and family, total strangers. And I'm here today because you all helped me. We tend to stereotype victims as grisly headlines, self-destructive women, damaged goods. The question, why does she stay, is code for some people for it's her fault for staying. as if victims intentionally choose to fall in love with men intent upon destroying us. But since publishing Crazy Love, I have heard hundreds of stories from men and women who also got out, who learned an invaluable life lesson from what happened, and who rebuilt lives, joyous, happy lives, as employees, wives, and mothers, lives completely free of violence. Like me, because it turns out that I'm actually a very typical domestic violence victim and a typical domestic violence survivor. I remarried a kind and gentle man. We have those 3 kids. I have that black lab, and I have that minivan. What I will never have again, ever, is a loaded gun held to my head by someone who says that he loves me. Now, right now, maybe you're thinking, wow, this is fascinating. Or, wow, how stupid was she? But this whole time, I've actually been talking about you. I promise you, there are several people listening to me right now who are currently being abused, or who were abused as children, or who are abusers themselves. Abuse could be affecting your daughter, your sister, your best friend right now. I was able to end my own crazy love story by breaking the silence. I'm still breaking the silence today. It's my way of helping other victims. And it's my final request of you. Talk about what you heard here. Abuse thrives only in silence. You have the power to end domestic violence simply by shining a spotlight on it. We victims need everyone. We need every one of you to understand the secrets of domestic violence. Show abuse the light of day by talking about it with your children, your coworkers, your friends and family. Recast survivors as wonderful, lovable people with full futures. Recognize the early signs of violence and conscientiously intervene, de-escalate it, show victims a safe way out. Together, we can make our beds, our dinner tables, and our families the safe and peaceful oases they should be. Thank you.
Does this case involve co-occurrence? How would you address co-occurrence? What would your response be now? What were her fears? What resources and services would you suggest?
Hi, my name is Deb Green. I am the SANE coordinator for Sarah House. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about how to respond to these sex assault, domestic violence, and strangulation calls that you might be receiving once you start a program for a rural community. We discovered that there were some barriers to getting these services to their survivors that need these services. What happens is the patients will show up at the hospital, and that the hospitals don't provide these services. A lot of, especially in small communities, they don't have a SANE nurse, SANE program, and so the patients are told that they need to go someplace else to have these exams done. And often that's a very long distance for them to drive to be able to get the SANE exam. And then by doing that, they're being re-traumatized by having to tell their narrative multiple times. So we felt that the solution was to take the care and services to the survivor. And that's where the mobile SANE program was born out of that need. So the first issue that came up was funding. How are we going to fund this program? Sarah House is a nonprofit organization. All of our funding comes from grants, donations, and fundraising. As you can see on this slide, 86% of our funding comes from federal grants, 8% comes from state grants, 4% foundation, and 2% comes from donations and fundraisings. We have two major fundraisers each year. One of our fundraisers is a prairie golf tournament. There is a local farmer who is a generous supporter of Sarah House, and every year he turns part of his farm into a golf course. Teams of 4 sign up for a morning of great fun and some friendly competition, all for a great cause. The second fundraiser is a 5K run walk, again held at this gentleman's farm, and it's a beautiful scenic run walk around the property in support of Sarah House. So that's where the funding comes from for this program. Then we began to think about some of the equipment that we might need to be able to perform these exams in remote locations. I started out by making a spreadsheet of everything that we have in our current exam room and thinking about what we would need to have in our mobile exam room, and then getting estimates for costs on those items that we might need. As you can see, I listed literally every item that was in our exam room, no matter how small. And some of these things we determined we didn't really need to necessarily have with us, but part of our agreement with the different hospitals was that we would supply our own supplies. We would not require them to supply anything for us. You'll see here that I included a touchpad cart. This was to house all of the equipment that we had and supplies that we were going to need. And I also included a touch screen laptop for each nurse. We have 2 nurses, so we had 2 laptops to help the nurses with documentation. Let me first say that I have no financial agreements with any of the companies that I'm going to be talking about here. I'm not saying that one company is better than the other. These are just the choices that we made for ourselves. You can look at other options, and I'm not going to go into great detail about these things. I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview of the things that we chose. So the first thing that we looked at is we wanted to be able to have a colposcope that was portable, that we could take to the different areas that we were going to be going to. And so we ended up going with the EVA Mobile ODT colposcope, and it works really well for being able to carry. I mean, it's basically the size of a cell phone, and it's in a casing, and so it's just a really portable, nice colposcope that works really well for our purposes. As I mentioned, we purchased 2 of these medical carts. Basically, they're like a crash cart, but they were just beige carts. And the reason we did this is because the first 2 MOUs that we got, and we'll talk about MOUs in a little bit, but we got 2 MOUs, Memorandum of Understanding, with 2 hospitals. And so we wanted to be able to house our equipment at the hospital so that the nurse didn't have to necessarily always carry all this equipment with them, and so they could just go to the hospital and all the equipment would be there. We would put our colposcope in there, we would keep our camera equipment in there, all of our medical supplies, extra sex assault kits, everything would be in this one cart. And so we purchased 2 of these carts. They had a lock, a touchpad lock on it, so that the equipment would be secured in that cart. As I mentioned, we bought 2 laptop computers, one for each nurse, so that they could do their documentation as they're doing the examination. We did purchase cameras for each of the facilities, for each of the nurses, and we chose this Nikon D3500 DSLR. It's a kind of a middle of the road. It's not a super fancy camera, but it does have the capability of some really nice, clear close-up photos that we're able to use and to get, and it works really well for our purposes and wasn't super expensive, and so we were able to purchase those for our kits, and we just bought them off of Amazon, and they weren't super expensive, and it was just really really helpful to have these cameras. We also needed to make sure that we could do the close-up photos of injuries. So I purchased 2 of these micro lenses so that we could take up those really close-up photos. A ring flash was something that was really important that we needed because you want to have consistent lighting, and so it was very important that we had that ring flash so that we could have that good lighting all of the time to be able to see the colors of bruises and to see those injuries really clearly. We did purchase swab dryers for each of the kits. We felt that this was something that we wanted to have. Of course, you can always just air dry them, the swabs, but we felt that we wanted to have the swab dryer so that we could get them expedited and we didn't have to wait a super long time before the swabs dried so we could get them to law enforcement. So we did purchase the swab dryer for these for our sex assault kits. Of course, we needed to have speculums and speculum lights to be able to do internal exams to look at the vagina and cervix, to look for injuries. Of course, we have these in our exam rooms currently in our office, but we did need to make sure we had a supply that we could keep them at various sizes in our mobile kits, our mobile exam kits, so that we could do these exams. Some of the smaller supplies that we did include also to have in our mobile kits was a blood pressure cuff, an otoscope, a stethoscope, pulse oximeters, a thermometer, and a pen light. Those were things that we felt we would need with different exams, especially the pen light we would use particularly in strangulation exams, otoscope as well, looking in the ears to look for petechiae in the ears, and so we felt that there was these were important items that we would need for each kit as well. Other miscellaneous items, the ABFO rulers for taking photos with measurements, the Tuladine blue dye, KY jelly, saline bullets, and evidence tape were just some other things that we wanted to make sure that we had in our kits. Also, we needed to have exam gloves, 2x2 gauze pads, urine cups, and Foley catheters to be able to look at the hymen. We wanted to be able to have that as an option to be able to isolate the hymen to look at that for injuries. And then the sex assault evidence collection kits was another thing that, of course, was the mandatory thing that we needed to have. We get these from Searchy, and they are provided at no cost to us. So that was a nice perk that we didn't have to worry about having to pay for those, and so we just get those from them. The next area that was a concern was how we were going to staff for this mobile program. When we started the program, I was the only nurse on staff, and so we needed to find out a way that we could increase the number of staff that we had in order to be able to staff a mobile SANE program. So some of the issues are that challenges that we have is that there are very few seasoned SANE nurses in the area. There are a few that have gone through the training and have worked for a time as SANE nurses, but pretty much those people who have that training sort of had a been there, done that attitude, and they weren't interested in participating in a call rotation. They just didn't want to do it anymore for whatever reason. Some of them were going to school. Some of them had families that they just weren't interested in taking that call and having to get out in the middle of the night and go for an exam, and so they had their own reasons, and it just what didn't work out to recruit any of those that had already had the training. So we thought about growing our own nurses. I went to like labor and delivery units, EDs in different hospitals, and talked with them and tried to recruit nurses that way, that we could train and grow our own, basically. And that presents its own set of challenges, because with that, we're a small program. We don't do a ton of exams like they do in the bigger cities. And so getting them, a new person, enough exams to be able to develop competency and have them feel comfortable taking call and going out on these exams on their own, and then maintaining that competency, was a huge issue. A plus for that is that the training is free because of the initiative of the Colorado Sane Safe program. That didactic training is free. They also have a clinical skills lab, and they also have a program where they can shadow SANE nurses for a certain number of shifts, and they can get several exams in under their belt and get to see how that works, and put that knowledge that they've learned to the practice and be able to do that. But the problem really becomes after they get out of that, and how they're going to maintain that competency. So that became a real problem, and we had a couple of different nurses that said, yeah, that sounds great, and we got them on board and got them trained, and then for whatever reason it just didn't work out for them. They just didn't stick with it, because a lot of it had to do with they just didn't get enough skills, competency as far as being able to maintain that, and they just didn't feel right about it. And so we ended up losing a couple of nurses along the way. I'm glad to say that we did hire another nurse that has worked out really well. She's doing a great job. And so we personally, in our program, and it works well for us, we have 2 nurses, myself and another nurse, and we split the call rotation. We take a week at a time, but we're not a super busy program. We don't have, we don't get called out every single night. We couldn't do it that way if we did, because it would be too exhausting. And very rarely do we have more than 1 exam at a time when we do get called out. But we're both very committed and very willing to help each other. And so if that does happen, that we get another call for an exam when we're already out on one, we can call the other one, and we're more than happy to come in and help. So we do support each other really well. So as I mentioned, with the staffing, some of the issues with the call schedule, and like I said, we do a week at a time, and that works well for us. And you just have to figure out for yourself and the kind of program that you have, and how often you're getting calls, how that's going to work for you, and how many nurses you need to be able to cover that rotation, so that your nurses aren't getting burned out all the time. And then the call response time, how long can you reasonably put it out there that you're going to respond to these cases, depending on the locations of the hospitals that you're going to respond to, or facilities you're going to respond to, or whatever. How long is your call response time? So the next thing that we did was to develop a memorandum of understandings with the different hospitals in the district that we serve, the 7 counties that we serve. So I started out by meeting with the CNO, the CEO, or the ED director, whoever was the person that was going to be in charge of, a lot of times it was all of the above, but whoever was the person that was going to be in charge of driving this thing and letting us get into the hospital and get this thing done. So like I said, a lot of times it was all of the above. It was the CNO, the CEO, and the ED director. And then I would send them a draft MOU that just kind of had the basics of it. a lot of the hospitals, a lot of the hospitals weren't corporately owned, and so they were just fine with the draft MOU that I had. And the ones that were corporately owned, a lot of times they had to send it through their legal team, and so that took a while sometimes to get those back. But I would get that draft MOU and would line out what was our responsibility, what was the hospital's responsibility. And then I would tour the ED and talk with the staff a little bit about logistics. Where would we logistically, where would we put the patients when they come in? What was their responsibility? And what would that look like? Making sure that there was a room that in the ED that we could put the patients that had walls and not just a curtain, because we needed privacy for the patient. And just really going through all those things and what that would look like when we actually started doing the exams. And then I would follow up with emails and phone calls, and just kind of reminding them about the MOU until we finally would get those through. Once the MOU was signed, I would provide in-person training with the ED providers, the nursing staff, and we'd talk about the services that are provided by Sarah House. I would go into a lot of detail about how do they get a hold of us? What do they do when they need a SANE exam? What information do they need to provide for us? And how do they get a hold of us? And then I would go into what the SANE exam entails, because I wanted them to understand the detail of what we go into so that they would know why it takes us a long time, because this isn't like just a quick ER exam, triage exam. This is a very detailed exam, and it takes a lot of time for us to be with this patient. And then I would also always, anytime I have a captive audience, I like to talk about strangulation, because I've become very passionate about strangulation and how serious it is. And so I would also provide training about strangulation for the staff. So we initially started with this is our map of the area that we serve, the 7 counties that we serve. We initially started with 2 MOUs, and they were both in Morgan County. Well, no, one was in Morgan County, one was in Logan County. And we started with the ones that were closest to us and trying to just get our feet in the door and get the program off the ground. And then we branched out, and the goal is to get an MOU with all the facilities that are in our area, our district. So we currently have 10 MOUs that are active. And one of the things that I have done along the way is I've made the MOUs so that they automatically renew each year, which everybody has been really, really receptive to that idea, so that you don't have to constantly be looking at, this one was signed in January, this one was signed in April, this one was signed in October, and trying to have to keep on track of when to renew them. So they all automatically renew every January 1st, unless one party or the other decides to cancel it. And so that's been really nice. I don't have to chase after them and constantly be remembering who needs to have theirs renewed. So we had some growing pains along the way, and some of the lessons that we learned, we'll talk about that. The first thing was that we talked about the carts that we bought and how we were going to put those in the hospital emergency rooms and keep all of our supplies in there. What we found was that the hospital staff, ED staff, they would move the cart. It would be in their way, and so they would move the cart constantly. And we would have to spend time every time we'd go in to do an exam playing, well, where's Waldo, trying to find the cart to begin with. And the other issue was that they would not keep the equipment plugged in. So we would have our camera and our colposcope in the cart, and we would have the cords that came out of there and had to be plugged in. And that was part of it when we stored the card over there. We explained to them that this needed to stay plugged in all the time so that we would have that equipment available to us when we got there. And a lot of times we would get there and the camera or the colposcope was dead, and we'd have to charge it before we could use it. And on top of that, they actually even lost the stand for our colposcope. So it was problematic having this cart there and trying to maintain it and keep things plugged in and find out where it's at and all that. So we decided not to do that anymore. And so we took the carts out and we went with a large suitcase. I bought these little tackle boxes, which actually worked really well for all of our small supplies. And then we have I got a suitcase that would fit our swab dryer in, and then we'd have the tackle box with all of our small supplies. This speculums would fit in the little zipper pouches, and we'd have room in there for the sex assault kits. I'd have in there all my vital signs equipment. So we had everything in there that we needed, and then we would just have to remember to bring our camera and colposcope along with us, along with this suitcase. And so that's what we started doing. And basically we each have our own kit set up like this, and we just take it with us when we go to any of the areas that are locations where we are doing exams. As far as response time, I think the only thing I can say about that is don't overpromise and underdeliver. It's really tempting to say we're going to respond within an hour, but you have to be realistic about it. And as bad as I don't want to say that, these are not emergency exams. It's important to the patient, of course, and for the patient it is an emergency, but it's not really an emergency. And so you just have to be able to not promise something that you can't deliver on. So you don't want to put in your MOU that you're going to have an hour response time, because you may not be able to keep that. We are seeing patients and victims, survivors in our office. And so if I'm in the middle of an exam or a forensic interview or something like that in my office, I may not be able to get there within an hour. It may take me, I need to finish what I'm doing before I can get to leave to go to that other exam. And so you want to be reasonable about what kind of a time frame. And then the other issue for us too is that we have a very large area that we serve. And so some of these hospitals are an hour and a half, 2 hours away, or even more. And so it's not realistic for me to promise that I can be there in an hour when it's an hour and a half away. So we have to be reasonable about that. So what kind of things do our SANE nurses do at Sarah House? One of the things that we do is we offer every child that comes into Sarah House for a forensic interview, we offer them a wellness exam. And a wellness exam is basically a head-to-toe exam, kind of like when they go to the doctor. We're literally looking at their bodies from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet, looking at their bodies to make sure that their bodies are okay. And while we're doing that, we're looking for any injuries that they might have, or any scarring, or any evidence that there was an injury at one time, and making sure that their bodies are okay and being able to reassure them that their bodies are okay. A lot of times that's just huge for patients, kids to know that even though something tragic has happened to them, that they're okay and that they're going to be okay. We're also part of the multidisciplinary team, and by that I mean that we're part of the group that sits in with as part of the team that actually sits in and observes the forensic interview. So the reason we did that is that this way we're able to hear what the child is disclosing. We know what the allegations are. We know what the child discloses. And so we're not having to ask that child to repeat anything that they've already said in the forensic interview. And so it's one thing, it keeps them from saying something different than what they said in the exam, in the interview. And it also just keeps from re-traumatizing them from having to tell their story over and over again. And so we are part of that multidisciplinary team. We also perform medical forensic exams on these kids. If they do disclose within the time frame that we can collect evidence, then we will do a medical forensic exam on the child and collect evidence for DNA testing. A lot of times kids don't report these assaults until months or years even later, and so we don't often get that opportunity, but occasionally we will get a child that has an outcry and within that 3-day time frame, and we'll be able to do those medical forensic exams. So we do get to do those occasionally. Both of our nurses are members of what's called the CARE Network, and this is a program that is out of Children's Hospital. And basically we were provided specialized training through Children's to be able to do medical exams on kids that have been physically or sexually abused, and they have to meet certain age criteria for these exams. And once we do these exams, we're able to upload the exams into a secure network that gets seen by a mentor, our mentor, who is a pediatric abuse specialist, child abuse specialist. And then they'll go over the case with us, and they'll let us know, if we needed to do something that we didn't do, how, what did our photos look like? Are they good enough? Do we need to work on that? What kinds of things they need from us more than what we did, so that we're learning from that and getting more information later on, and letting us know if we need to do additional testing or what kinds of things, that we need to do for that particular patient. So it's kind of great because it's the best of both worlds for the patient, because they're getting the expertise of Children's without having to go to Children's, because we do get that feedback from them. So that's a really good thing. We already talked a lot about the Mobile SANE program. We both do that. We take call for that, and so we're going to those facilities that call us for exams. We see survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and strangulation. So basically across the age spectrum, we see patients that are very, very young and patients that are very, very old. So any age that has any of these issues, we will see them for a medical exam. So how do patients get to us? Pediatric and adolescent patients have to be referred to us by law enforcement or DHS. We don't take, just a patient mom that brings in the kid. We don't just do those. They have to be referred to us by law enforcement or DHS. We want them to look into the case and see that there is just cause for us to do these exams, so that we're not traumatizing kids by doing detailed exams on them when it's not really necessary. Adults can either come to us through the crisis line. We have a 24-hour crisis line that they can call. They might come in through the emergency department, or they can be referred to us by law enforcement. But they do have the right to report anonymously, as well as a medical report where they report to law enforcement, but they're not wanting to participate in the investigation or a full law enforcement report. So if they come in through the crisis line or the emergency department, we want to make sure that we're not letting law enforcement have that information until we know what the patient is wanting to do as far as reporting. Services that we provide, we already talked about the medical forensic exams, forensic evidence collection, up to 72 hours or 3 days for pediatric patients, prepubescent patients, and up to 120 to 168 hours or 5 to 7 days for adult and adolescent patients. We do domestic violence exams, we do strangulation exams, sexual assault exams, We do child physical abuse exams, child wellness exams, and we also do forensic photography. So who knew that when we got into this we were going to be specialists in photography, but we've learned a lot about photography and have to be pretty good at taking these pictures to have them look decent, to be able to represent evidence for a court case. Sarah House does a lot of prevention as well. Our wellness exams are considered preventative as well. We want to make sure these kids are okay, and while we're doing these exams, we can talk to them about their bodies and about, you know, taking care of their bodies and just different things as far as, you know, cleanliness and taking care of themselves. And you know, if they talk to them about their periods, if they've started having periods, and just giving them some information and letting them know that their bodies are working normally, that kind of stuff. We also have a book that we provide, and we talk to them about the swimsuit lesson, and it's basically that the parts of your body that's covered by your swimsuit are the parts that no one should see or touch without your permission. We talk about secrets and about good secrets and bad secrets, and what is okay to keep as a secret, you know, and things that are a surprise, you know, are okay to keep as a secret. You know, if you're having a surprise party for mom, it's okay that you don't tell her about that secret because it's a surprise for her, and we're gonna do something fun. But if somebody touches you and tells you that you have to keep it a secret, that's not a good secret, and you don't want to keep that secret. You want to tell somebody. And then we talk to them about identifying safe adults in their life and making sure that they have some people in their life that they can trust, that they can go and talk to if something is happening to them. We're going to switch gears again, and we're going to talk about strangulation. So I have a short video I'd like for you to watch first.
While I was away on vacation, my daughter was with my parents, and he came and took my daughter. Then left a voicemail saying that if I wanted to see my daughter again, that he had to pick me up from the airport, from me returning port. I thought I could sweet talk him and just calmly get my daughter back and control the situation. So if we're going to talk, let's go outside, because I don't want it to be loud for the children. You know, let's keep this calm. We had had a few police reports of domestic violence already. Nothing on the scale that we were going to go to, but we had those, so I knew who I was dealing with. He started throwing patio furniture at me. After ducking and dodging, I said, you know what, you need to go. I'm going to call the police. And as I went for the door to go inside the house to call the police, he grabbed me, put me in a chokehold, and tried to break my neck. At that point, I can remember thinking, I can't fight this man. He's 6'9". I'm gonna go limp. And at about that point is when I also lost my hearing. Throughout the incident, I have pockets of memory. Either I was unconscious or there was brain damage or something happened. I don't remember every little step, but from being in a chokehold, then I can remember being off the ground and him holding me up by my neck and shaking me and choking me, so much so that he then fell on top of me. I did pass out, black out, unconscious, and I came to with his mouth on mine, and realizing later from what the paramedic said is he was giving me CPR, and the bruises on my chest showed that he was giving me CPR. He called 911, and I do know on the 911 tape it does say that he says that he had killed his wife. He says, I just killed my wife. And then the first officer was on pretty quickly. He was there. He subdued my ex-husband and then came to me and put his hands on me and told me everything was going to be okay. Then 2 other officers arrived about the same time the paramedics did. Well, he was arrested. He was taken by the 3rd officer, who was a rookie. And instead of being charged or booked with attempted murder, he was booked with spousal assault, which hurt the case later on. He was released from jail, or he was bailed out of jail before I got out of the emergency room. And he then finally pled to spousal abuse and assault, and he was on probation. They did take away his guns, thank goodness, now that I'm learning, and he broke the criminal protective restraining order twice, but still nothing happened. Every time we went back to court, it was a slap on the wrist. Don't do that again. Nothing. Nothing happened to him.
strangulation has become more and more common in domestic violence situations, in sexual assault situations, and we're even seeing an uptick in pediatric strangulations in child abuse. So it's very, very, very common, unfortunately. And so, as I mentioned briefly, I have become very passionate about strangulation. I've done a lot of training on strangulation and learned a lot about it, and just want to share this information because I am very passionate about it. Also, I do training for people on strangulation. So there are some myths about strangulation that I want to go over with you and give you correct information about strangulation. The first myth is that victims should be able to detail their attack. The truth of the matter is that trauma impacts the brain's ability to store memories. The hippocampus is critical for forming memories, organizing, and storing memories. It is the most sensitive to the lack of oxygen. If no blood flow, then the brain is not working. And if there's no blood flow, there's no memory. And no memory means damage to the hippocampus. So when someone is strangled, then that's a loss of oxygen to the brain. There's no blood flow to the brain during that time frame. So that's one of the reasons why there's no memory during that time. Remember that there's no typical response to sexual assault and domestic violence. We can't say that, they didn't act like a victim should act, because everybody responds to trauma in a different way. And we want to take a victim-centered approach, which includes believing the victim and not making judgments against the victim because of the way they're acting. We seem to know a lot about the fight or flight response to stress and trauma, but we don't really often think about the freeze response, which is a very common response to trauma, and it's very common in sex assault cases. It's kind of the body's response to kind of like the deer in the headlight, that they see this thing coming at them and they just freeze. And you can have tonic immobility, where you're aware of the situation, you just can't move, or you can have collapsed immobility, where you pass out and can't move. So I was told about a story about a young lady, and she and her friend were going to a frat party, and they were really excited about this party because there was a guy there that was going to be there, and this young lady was really interested in him, and she was hoping that he would notice her. So they go to this party, and sure enough, the guy was there, and he was kind of hanging out by the keg, and so she went up and started talking to him, and he started, giving her alcohol and kind of talking to her, and just kept supplying her with beer after beer after beer. And pretty soon she got pretty wasted, and so he says, "Why don't you going to go upstairs with me?" And she's like, "Sure," So she goes upstairs with him, and they start making out, and she's like, "Wow, this is awesome. This is what I was really hoping he would notice me, and this is more than I even hoped for. This is great," and she's all excited and happy, and everything's going fine, and then suddenly he decides that he wants more than just making out, and he tries to push her down onto the bed, and she's like, she didn't know what to do because she was not wanting that, and she said no, and he pushed her down on the bed and decided, yes, he wanted to have sex with her. And so he forced her and he raped her. And she went into this tonic immobility, and she just froze. Well, he finished what he was doing, and he went out to his friend that was outside the room and said, "Hey, buddy, there's a girl in here, and she'll let you do anything you want to do. Just go in there, and you can do whatever you want to her." And so he goes in, and she's laying there on the bed and just laying there, and so he takes off his pants and he rapes her as well. And then he goes out and he finds another friend, and he says, "Hey, there's a lady out here, a girl out here, and she'll let you do whatever you want to her." And so he goes in and he rapes her. Before it was all over, 5 guys raped this young girl that night, and she was in this state of tonic immobility the whole time. Well, her friend was getting worried because she couldn't find her and she didn't know what was going on. And so she went upstairs. She heard people talking about this girl that was having sex with all these guys. And so she went upstairs and she found her friend laying on this bed and just in this tonic immobility state. And so she shook her and tried to wake her up, and she slapped her, and finally she comes around, and the first thing she said was, "I didn't even fight back, I just froze." And that's so common that we feel guilty when we do have this freeze response, because we feel like that we were supposed to do something different. We were supposed to fight back. We were supposed to be aggressive or something along those lines, and we didn't. We just froze. But that's a normal response. And so that's something to reassure victims when they tell you that they didn't fight back, they just froze. That you can tell them that's a very normal response, and especially in sex assault is very normal. So why don't we believe victims? Rebecca Campbell did some studies on this because she was interested in what makes people not believe victims. And so she was interviewing these police officers, and this particular officer, and I'm sure he's not representative of most officers, but his comment was, the stuff they say makes no sense. So no, I don't always believe them. And yeah, I let them know that. And then they say, never mind, I don't want to do this. Okay, complainant refused to prosecute, case closed. So this is someone that, is not believing the victim and is letting them know very clearly that they don't believe them. And so why would the victim want to continue in this situation when they know that they're not being believed? So what I want to know is, why is it that the stuff they say doesn't make sense? So let's look at that a little bit further. I like to think about this in kind of like in a package of Post-it notes. So I'm going to take a package of Post-it notes, and on this package of Post-it notes, I'm going to write on each individual one of those Post-it notes 2 or 3 words, and I'm going to detail on that package of Post-it notes in 2 or 3 words on each page everything I did last weekend. And I'm going to tell that story. And so it's going to take the whole package for me to tell everything that happened. And then I'm going to go into your home and I'm going to hide these Post-it notes all over your house and in every little nook and cranny I can find, and I'm just going to hide them. So how long do you think it would take you to find those Post-it notes? Probably a really long time, right? Well, not only that, how long would it take you to find the Post-it notes and then put them back in order so that the story makes sense? Probably a really, really long time, if ever, right? Well, that's what happens to our brains during trauma. Our brains take these events and it puts it on these quote unquote Post-it notes, and it hides it in our brain because it knows that we can't handle everything at once. And so it allows us to have little pieces of it here and there, but it doesn't always give it to us in order. And so eventually you might get it all back. Maybe you won't. There may be parts of it that you never recover, but it's the brain's way of coping. And so this is why when you interview a victim, sometimes they're all over the place and they say things that are really out of order, and they're not being chronological because they can't be, because they don't remember that in that way, and they're just remembering things as they come to them, and it's not necessarily going to be in chronological order. And that's okay, because it's their brain is reacting the way that trauma is allowing them to react. So we want to make sure that we understand that if they're not making sense, that's trauma. And it's not that they're making stuff up or that they're lying about something or anything like that. It's just that that's trauma, and they're trying to take these Post-it notes and put them back in order, but they can't because they don't have all the pieces. So I think that's a good analogy to understand what happens to your brain during trauma. So what about police officers? What if an officer is involved in a shooting or a critical incident? How long do they wait before anyone is allowed to speak to the officer that's involved? Police usually wait 2 to 3 days before interviewing officers that are involved in shootings or critical incidents. Why is that? The primary concern is how to obtain an officer's clearest recall while avoiding unnecessary memory contamination and protecting the officer's physical and emotional well-being. And this is much more complex than just a memory issue. So they understand this concept when it comes to other officers and how they're respecting that and wanting to make sure that they're doing the best thing for the officer, for their well-being, as well as getting the clearest memory picture when they interview them. But we don't allow that for our victims. And I'm saying that for all of us. You know, we interview them immediately after an event happens, and we expect them to tell us everything that happened, and we expect that to be the gospel truth. And so later on, if they interview them again and they tell a different story, or they remember things differently, or they remember things that they didn't remember before, then they often get asked, well, were you lying then or are you lying now? Because your stories don't match. And so we need to give them some grace and think about trauma and how that trauma works with their memory, and understand that that's why that they're not remembering. They remember things differently now than they did the first time you interviewed them, and take that into account for what they're remembering now. Myth number 2: strangulation and choking are the same thing. Strangulation means intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly impeding airflow or blood flow. Strangulation is a form of asphyxia characterized by the closure of blood vessels and/or air passages of the neck as a result of external pressure on the neck. Choking is an internal obstruction of the airway by a foreign object. So your victims, a lot of time, more than likely, they're going to say, he choked me. They don't use the word strangulation. They don't understand that concept. And so they're going to say, he choked me. He put me in a chokehold. So understand that when you hear that they're talking about strangulation. There are 3 different methods of strangulation: manual strangulation, which is done with the hands; ligature, which is done with a cord or a rope or some kind of an object; and then hanging, which is done, usually like suicide, like hanging. Strangulation is very common in intimate partner violence. 1 in 4 women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 7 men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. So it's very common that we see this in our victims. Of women at high risk, 68 to 80% of women will experience a near fatal strangulation by their partner at some point in their relationship. Strangulation is among the most lethal forms of domestic violence. Loss of consciousness can occur within 5 to 10 seconds, and death within minutes. Domestic violence is one of the most chronically underreported crimes. Only 25% of all physical assaults get reported, 20% of all sexual assaults get reported, and 50% of all stalking gets reported. And with the number of cases that do get reported, a woman will be assaulted by her partner or ex-partner 35 times before reporting to the police. 92% of women who have experienced intimate partner violence, including strangulation, are estimated to have suffered from some type of traumatic brain injury. 38% report losing consciousness, and 94% believe they were going to die. And I truly believe that statistic to be true because almost every patient I've ever done a strangulation exam on have told me I thought I was going to die. So that's a very common thing. If a victim is strangled one time, the odds for homicide increase 750% compared to victims who have not been strangled. So why do victims stay? Abusers will go to extremes to prevent the victim from leaving. One study found that in interviews with men who have killed their partners, that either threats of separation by their partner or actual separations were most often the precipitating events that led to the murder. A victim's reasons for staying with their abusers are extremely complex, and in most cases are based on the reality that their abuser will follow through with the threats they have issued to keep them trapped. Women aren't always the victim. 1 in 7 men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. 13.8% of the victims of severe physical domestic violence are men. When men are victims of domestic violence, you'll see that gendered stereotypes make it difficult to view men as victims and women as perpetrators of domestic violence. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around that because we think of men as being the dominant partner, and so it's very difficult for us to think about it in those terms. Female perpetrators also tend to use different methods to abuse men than men do for women. They often rely on psychological abuse and manipulation. And male victims of abuse often feel isolated, embarrassed, and emasculated, making it difficult for them to come forward and talk about the abuse that they suffer. So what do we know about perpetrators of domestic violence? We know that men who kill cops often have a history of domestic violence. And we also know that when women leave a strangler, the strangler becomes a stalker. Remember what we talked about, that only 50% of stalkings get reported. So this is a very common thing. So why should we care about that? These men are killing cops, and that's very common. And the women, or when they leave the strangler, they're becoming stalked. And so it's very important that we care about these things and look at these things. When I heard the statistic about that men who kill cops usually have a history of domestic violence, I was curious about that. And so I started watching very carefully when I would hear about a cop that had been shot and killed, and I would look into it, and every single time almost every time it seemed like that when I would look at the case, I would find that the perpetrator had a history of domestic violence. So these are just some examples of cases that I looked at where cops were killed and the perpetrator had a history of domestic violence. And so I found that to be very true. And still today, I still keep looking at these cases when I see them, and I find that it's very common that these men are very, very dangerous. And so we need to find a way that, we're letting our police officers know when they're going into a case, when they're responding, that these men are very dangerous and they can be very serious cases. We're seeing a connection between mass shootings and domestic violence as well. In 2021, we were seeing the connection between police officers being murdered in the line of duty by men with a history of violence against women, mass shooters with a history of violence against women, and very often strangulation assault, and the history of strangulation assault before a woman is actually shot. 59.1% of mass shootings were DV related. 68.2% of perpetrators were had either killed at least one family member or had a history of domestic violence. Myth number 3, strangulation always leaves visible injuries. Sorry about that. In fact, only half of victims have visible injuries, and of those 50%, only 15% had injuries that could be photographed. A victim can be strangled even fatally and have no marks. Often bruises don't show up for at least 24 hours. And only 3% of strangulation victims even seek medical attention at all. So here's our anatomy lesson. We have the carotid arteries, which are the red vessels, and they take oxygenated blood to the brain, head, and neck. And it takes 11 pounds of pressure to occlude the carotid arteries. Next, you have the jugular veins, which are the blue veins, and they take the deoxygenated blood from the brain and the head and neck back down to the heart and lungs to get reoxygenated. It takes only 4.4 pounds of pressure to occlude the jugular veins because they're more external. Next, we have the thyroid cartilage, which is the number 4 right in here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. The thyroid cartilage is important. It's a butterfly-shaped gland, and it has a very large blood supply to it, and it has nerves that are important to voice quality. So because it is very superficial, it's very easy for this to get damaged. And so you have to worry about bleeding from that if it gets damaged. And also, you'll find a lot of times victims of strangulation will have a very hoarse voice after they've been strangled, and that's because of the damage to the thyroid cartilage, because of the innervation to it that has to do with speech. And then we have the trachea. The trachea are the 20 rings of cartilage and connective tissue. That is the airway that goes down to the lungs. And it takes 33 pounds of pressure to occlude or fracture the trachea. So you have the carotid and the jugular, and the carotid takes oxygenated blood to the brain, and the jugular brings the deoxygenated back down from the brain. So you have good blood going up, bad blood coming down. If you interrupt the process, then you have a life or death plumbing problem. If the pressure increases to the point that no oxygenated blood is getting to the brain cells, this is called anoxia. Once anoxia occurs in a strangulation assault, the victim loses 32,000 neurons and 230 million synapses per second. This is permanent brain damage. Those neurons and synapses will never come back to life, and they will never heal. So here's a little equation for you. If you have carotid artery occlusion in the anterior neck, which is 11 pounds of pressure for 10 seconds, and you add to that the jugular vein occlusion in the lateral neck, which is 4.4 pounds of pressure for 10 seconds, then you get unconsciousness. And that is average. It takes about 6.8 seconds for that to occur. So let's get some perspective. How long did it take to occlude the jugular vein? If you remember, it was 4.4 pounds of pressure per second, pounds of pressure for 10 to 30 seconds. It only takes 6 pounds of pressure to pull the handgun trigger. And then what about the carotid artery? If you remember, it took 11 pounds of pressure for 10 to 20 seconds to occlude the carotid artery. It takes 20 pounds of pressure to open the pop top on a soda can. And what about the trachea? Remember, it's much firmer and with the cartilage, and so it takes 33 pounds of pressure to occlude or fracture the tracheal cartilage. An average adult male handshake takes 80 to 100 pounds of pressure. So that's just some everyday things you can compare to understand how little pressure it can take to actually do damage to someone in strangulation. This is Physiologic Consequences of Strangulation. It's put out by the Training Institute for Strangulation Prevention. And I think it's a really important piece of research that was done, because it shows us on a timeline how much time it takes for different events to happen. So, for example, it only takes 5 to 10 seconds before someone can be rendered unconscious. So the average is 6.8 seconds that it takes to render someone unconscious. And then at 15 seconds, the victim will lose control of their bladder. And at 30 seconds minimum, they will lose control of their bowels. So also you'll start to see petechiae on the face or head or neck or whatever. You'll see that anywhere between 10 and 30 seconds. Respiration ceases at 62 seconds or longer, and All patients had respiration ceasing between 62 and 157 seconds. So it really gives you a breakdown of when events happen on this timeline. But what I find really interesting is that a study was done recently of 130 cases of strangulation, of non-fatal strangulation, and only 6% of the perpetrators stopped strangling the victim on their own. And that suggests that strangulation should be investigated as an attempted homicide until evidence proves otherwise. So I think that this piece of paper really proves that for us, because if you think about it, it takes 5 to 10 seconds to render the victim unconscious. So a lot of times what happens is they will say that they were defending themselves, that this, she was crazy and she was trying to scratch my eyes out or whatever, and so I just had to get her off of me, and that's what happened. And I just did this for just a little bit to get her off of me because she was going crazy. So here's the reality. If your victim went unconscious, and let's say that they lost control of their bladder, and they have petechiae, okay? So the reality is that it only takes 5 to 10 seconds for the victim to become unconscious. And petechiae shows up at 10 to 30 seconds, and loss of bladder control at 15 seconds. So that tells you that he continued to strangle her past the time that she was unconscious. So if he was trying to defend himself, why would he continue to strangle her after she became unconscious? So that to me goes to motive, and that's why I feel like it definitely should be investigated as attempted homicide, because there's no reason to continue strangling someone after they become unconscious if you're just trying to protect yourself. For clinicians, it's the potential for delayed fatality that is the most concerning. Swelling can occur up to 24 to 48 hours post-injury, leading to airway compromise. Delayed morbidity and mortality has been reported days later as a result of vascular, neurologic, and/or respiratory complications, including carotid artery dissection and cerebral infarction. Carotid artery dissections are the #1 cause of strokes in patients under the age of 45. So this is why it's important that we have aggressive screening on patients with a CTA, which is a computed tomography with angiography. So we're getting that CT and we're looking at those vessels in the neck to make sure that there's not a tear in the neck, that there's not a vessel that's broken down. We want to be able to avoid strokes in strangled patients, because this can happen hours or years post-assault. And so we want to know at the time of the injury, was there a compromise in the vessels during that strangulation? Myth number 4. If the victim can speak, scream, or breathe, they are not being strangled. In fact, it takes 400 to 600 cc's of gas or air to inhale or exhale, which is breathing. It requires 50 cc's of gas or air to phonate, which means to speak. So to speak the words, "I can't breathe," requires 150 cc's of air, which is less air than it requires to inhale or exhale. And since strangulation involves obstruction of blood flow, a person can have complete obstruction and continue breathing until the moment they die from lack of oxygenated blood flow to the brain. So they can actually continue to breathe until they die. And myth number 5, strangulation cannot be harmful because people practice it, like martial arts, military, and law enforcement. Fact is that martial arts are a form of combat, and military and law enforcement use strangulation as a lethal form of force. A lot of law enforcement agencies don't allow the chokehold anymore because unless it is a lethal form of force is needed. And there are numerous incidences of death resulting from strangulation, and this can occur during otherwise supervised events such as sporting events and law enforcement training. So a lot of the agencies are not even using this anymore at all. So these are some possible clinical presentations that you might see as a result of a strangulation. And I just look at this and I think some of these things like, voice changes, sore throat, coughing, breathing changes. If I had a patient with those symptoms, I'm probably not thinking strangulation right away. I'm thinking maybe she's got COVID or something like that. Mental status changes, problems concentrating, memory loss, hypervigilance. You're probably thinking they've taken some kind of drug or something like that. So I think just to remember that, these are some typical symptoms and that you need to think outside the box and is this someone that you see frequently, that she comes to the ER with unexplained injuries, or maybe there's a history of domestic violence in the family and you're seeing these symptoms. Maybe just think outside the box a little bit and think about strangulation and talk to your victim about that. Let's go over some signs and symptoms of strangulation. This is just a little graphic that lists all the different signs and symptoms and shows a picture of what it might look like if you had some of these signs and symptoms. So we want to be trauma informed when we're talking to victims about strangulation. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to have the victim demonstrate on themselves or on you or another person what the perpetrator did to them. That's very re-traumatizing for them to have to actually put their hands around a living person's neck or their own neck to show on themselves what happened. So you don't want to do that. So what you can do instead, I have these pictures that I have they're on my documentation, and I can show these to the victim and have them point out which one of these is what it looked like that the perpetrator did to them. So they can just point to it and say, oh, it was the right arm from behind or whatever. And the other thing you can do is I have a mannequin head, and I can have them use that. It's an inanimate object, and so they can use that and demonstrate on the mannequin head what the perpetrator did to them. And then I usually take a picture of them doing that so that I have that for my records. We talked about petechiae a little bit ago. Petechiae are burst capillaries that occur above the point of pressure. They are pinpoint round spots that appear red, brown, or purple. They are tiny, usually measuring less than 1/8 of an inch. They may be found under and on the eyelids, around the eyes, face, scalp, palate, soft palate, neck, also in the inside the lower lip and in the hairline. So they can be anywhere above the area of pressure. Here are some additional photos of petechiae. You can see them on the cornea of the eye, on the eyelid, behind the ear, on the external eyelid. So you can kind of see different ways that they present. Petechiae do not prove strangulation, and their absence does not disprove it. They are simply a marker of increased pressure in the blood vessels above the strangulation site. However, the finding can be consistent with the patient's report of strangulation when the veins have been obstructed. So it does lend itself to helping support their history, but it does not prove or disprove strangulation. Another thing you might see are self-inflicted abrasions. This is especially true when there's a ligature. The victim is going to try to get that ligature off, and they'll put their hand up here and come down on trying to get that away, and you'll see those fingernail marks on their neck. Subconjunctival hemorrhage. These are broken vessels in the eyes. This indicates occlusion of the jugular veins. Erythema or redness from pressure. You might be able to see the location of pressure from the strangulation event. These are often not visible until 24 hours after the event. They may be visible with an alternate light source. I personally have not seen that, but that's what studies say. Ligature marks may be visible if a rope or cord or other object was used in the strangulation event. You're definitely going to see those marks on the neck if you have a ligature. Remember that anything can be used as a ligature, a necklace, a scarf, a cord, a belt, anything can be used as a ligature. So don't think it has to be a rope necessarily. This is a sort of a decision tree for a patient that presents with strangulation. And it just talks about, if they have certain symptoms, loss of consciousness, ligature marks, incontinence of bladder or bowel, just different symptoms on the left-hand side, then you want to consider giving them an aspirin. If there's going to be a delay in getting a radiographic study, and then you want to get that CTA, the CT with the angiogram, to rule out any kind of damage to the arteries. And then if the CT is negative, then you might want to have them stay in the hospital for observation, or if they have someone that can be responsible to keep an eye on them, then you can discharge them home with detailed instructions with the lethality assessment to return to the ER if they have neurologic signs and symptoms or other symptoms that means that their condition is worsening. On the right-hand side, it shows if they don't have loss of consciousness, there's no visual changes, no spots before their eyes, no tunnel vision, anything like that, no petechiae, no soft tissue trauma to the neck, none of those, then it's okay to just discharge them and not get that radiograph. So it's just a really nice tool to be able to make a decision about what kind of testing that patient needs. And this again is just more of the same thing. If they have a history of any of the things on the left-hand side, then you want to make sure you're getting that CTA to rule out life-threatening injuries. This is just an assessment card that is really helpful when you're, if you don't do this all the time. It's just a really helpful thing to have all the signs and symptoms listed on the left-hand side, a checklist for the paramedic or whomever in the center to make sure that the scene is safe, that you're safe, the victim's safe, that remember that they're being traumatized, and to provide reassurance and resources, assess the victim for signs of symptoms of strangulation and TBI, document your observations, give the victim an advisal about delayed consequences, assess for loss of consciousness, and then encourage them to get medical assistance. And then on the right-hand side, it talks about if the patient is pregnant or has life-threatening injuries, that lists the life-threatening injuries, that's when you need to be sure and transport the patient to the hospital. And then talks a little bit about delayed consequences and how the consequences can be delayed up to even a year or more. If you would, please take a moment to select the appropriate QR code. This will take you to a survey to evaluate the webinar, and we would really appreciate your input. Thank you. This concludes our presentation. I hope that you found it to be helpful. Our contact information is on here. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to answer any questions that you might have.